Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Alien professors introduce advanced math problem. Human solves it instantly and improves the formula. The Galactic Academy of Sciences stood as the most prestigious institution of higher learning in the universe, a beacon of knowledge where the brightest minds from hundreds of intelligent species gathered to push the boundaries of understanding. Built upon a massive floating structure in the neutral zone between star systems, the Academy was a testament to intergalactic cooperation. It housed scholars, researchers, and students from across the known galaxy, each selected for their extraordinary intellect and potential to contribute to the vast wealth of knowledge that civilizations had accumulated over millennia. Inside one of its most revered halls, the Grand Auditorium, a special event was about to take place. The room, capable of holding thousands, shimmered with soft ambient lighting, its walls constructed of living crystal that absorbed and reflected knowledge in a visual form, pulsing faintly with stored equations and scientific breakthroughs. At the center, an enormous holographic board floated in midair, displaying lines of intricate symbols, mathematical notations that transcended any single species' language. The symbols twisted and rearranged themselves, shifting as if they were alive, forming the problem that had remained unsolved for more than 5,000 years. The assembled audience consisted of students and scholars from various planets, each representing a species known for its intellectual prowess. Towering reptilian beings with elongated skulls and deep-set calculating eyes sat beside delicate insectoid creatures that communicated through complex bioluminescent pulses. Near them, crystalline entities shimmered softly, their bodies refracting light as they processed information through a network of microscopic data-storing filaments. Others in attendance were humanoid in form, but possessed enhancements, neural interfaces, biomechanical implants, or additional sensory organs that expanded their cognitive abilities beyond natural limitations. Among this gathering of superior intellects sat one lone human, Eric Morris. He was an unassuming figure, lacking any visible augmentations or genetic modifications. His dark brown hair was slightly unkempt, his attire practical and devoid of the sleek, high-tech elements so common among interstellar scholars. Unlike the other students who had arrived in transport pods linked directly to the Academy's data streams, he had walked in with nothing but a simple digital slate and a stylus tucked into his pocket. Though humans were no longer considered an entirely primitive species, they were still viewed as relatively young compared to the ancient civilizations present in the room. The general perception was that humans were adaptive, resilient, and surprisingly creative. But when it came to pure intellectual competition, they were rarely taken seriously in circles of advanced academia. Seated in the front row, Eric remained quiet as he observed the alien professors preparing for the event. At the center of the room, a tall, six-limbed professor with iridescent purple skin and 3 sets of golden eyes stepped forward. Professor Varen belonged to the Keltari race, a species renowned for their mastery of theoretical physics and complex multidimensional mathematics. With a slow, deliberate motion, he raised one of his slender arms, and the shifting equation on the holographic board froze in place. The audience fell into hushed anticipation. "This equation," Varen's voice resonated, amplified through the auditorium's acoustic field, "has eluded the greatest minds of the galaxy for millennia. It is a fundamental enigma woven into the very fabric of spacetime, a construct upon which entire fields of study have been built, yet it remains incomplete." His 3 pairs of eyes scanned the assembled students, lingering briefly on the crystalline beings known as the Vila, then shifting to the insectoid Zith scholars before finally resting momentarily on Eric. There was no malice in his gaze, only mild curiosity, an unspoken question as to why a human had chosen to participate in this challenge. "This is not merely a test of intelligence," Varen continued. "It is an invitation to peer into the unknown, to decipher what no one has yet understood. You will all be given access to the tools and knowledge at your disposal. The challenge begins now." With a wave of his hand, the board expanded, breaking into multiple layers of equations that formed a vast mathematical construct filling the space above the participants. The alien students wasted no time. Within seconds, multiple screens materialized around them as they summoned vast computational resources, drawing on centuries of research, advanced quantum processors, and their own immense intellects. Some worked in groups, exchanging theories in their native languages, while others relied on neural interfaces to process vast amounts of data in mere moments. A reptilian student, his scales shifting in color as he thought, muttered to himself as he analyzed the problem. His species, the Dra, were known for their unparalleled logical reasoning. His three-fingered hand traced through the air, forming complex geometric shapes as he attempted to visualize the underlying structure of the equation. Avila Scholar, her crystalline body flickering with pulses of thought, layered different mathematical models atop one another, trying to create a framework that would simplify the problem. Tiny filaments extended from her form, linking to a floating processor that rapidly compiled and tested various hypotheses. The Zith, their chitinous limbs tapping at holographic interfaces with mechanical precision, worked in synchronized harmony, each individual taking on a specific portion of the problem before combining their findings into a collective model. And yet, despite their collective genius, no one made meaningful progress. The equation remained as enigmatic as ever, its complexity resisting all attempts at simplification. Minutes turned into hours, and the air in the auditorium became thick with quiet frustration. Some of the students, confident in their initial approaches, had now resorted to simply staring at the shifting symbols, hoping for an epiphany that refused to come. Eric, however, had not moved. He sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the problem, but his expression was not one of confusion. Instead, he observed not just the equation, but the way the others were tackling it. He had no neural link, no advanced processing tools, no artificial enhancements, but he had something that many of these species, for all their intelligence, often lacked: intuition. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eric leaned forward and spoke for the first time since the challenge began. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Can I try?" A simple question cut through the low murmur of alien scholars. Some of them glanced at him in mild surprise, others with curiosity, and a few with outright skepticism. Professor Varon, who had been silently observing the struggle of his students, turned his golden eyes toward the human. "You wish to attempt the solution, Eric Morris?" The professor's tone was measured, though there was a faint trace of amusement. Eric nodded. "Yeah, I think I see something." A few students exchanged glances. The idea that a human, an unaugmented human, could claim to have a solution when the brightest minds of the galaxy were struggling seemed absurd. But Varon, to his credit, did not dismiss the request outright. He gestured toward the holographic board, allowing Eric full access. Eric pulled out his stylus, stood up, and approached the projection. He did not summon a neural processor, nor did he engage with the advanced data analysis tools available to the others. Instead, he began writing on his tablet, making calculations by hand. For the first time since the challenge began, the room fell into complete silence. Everyone was watching as Eric's hand moved with steady precision. The glow of the holographic board pulsed in response to his calculations. Every symbol he wrote adjusted and adapted to the alien script, translating seamlessly into the universal mathematical language recognized by the Galactic Academy. He paid no attention to the murmurs rippling through the audience behind him, nor to the skeptical glances cast in his direction. His focus remained solely on the numbers before him. The alien scholars, once fully engrossed in their own methods, now watched his work unfold with a mixture of intrigue and disbelief. Some tried to keep working on their respective approaches, but their concentration faltered as Eric's quiet confidence unsettled them. He was not second-guessing himself. He was not hesitating. That alone was enough to cause unease among the gathered intellectuals. Professor Varon observed in silence, his golden eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the human's process. His experience had taught him to recognize the difference between blind arrogance and genuine insight. The calm, methodical nature of Eric's movements suggested the latter, but it was too soon to tell. The reptilian scholar from the Dra species, whose iridescent scales darkened with growing frustration, clicked his claws against the metallic surface of his workstation. He had spent years studying the mathematical structures embedded in the equation, yet the more he attempted to deconstruct its layers, the more convoluted the solution became. He had mapped out its geometric properties in multidimensional space, trying to visualize its logic, but every attempt led to an incomplete model. The numbers refused to align, and each failed iteration only increased his mounting irritation. The crystalline Vila student, whose translucent body pulsed with shifting colors as she processed data, had initially been confident in her computational abilities. Using a quantum lattice network, she had engaged thousands of parallel processes to scan for patterns, searching for a sequence that would stabilize the equation's fluctuating structure. Yet despite the power of her technology, the equation resisted all pattern recognition. Every pathway she analyzed led to an informational paradox, rendering the equation unsolvable within her logical framework. The longer she examined it, the more the problem seemed to mock her intelligence. Meanwhile, the insectoid Zith scholars, who had formed a synchronized collective to approach the equation as a single analytical entity, found themselves caught in a frustrating loop. Their species specialized in cooperative problem-solving, each mind contributing a fragment of processing power to an overarching intelligence. Yet for all their efficiency, they could not establish a logical foundation on which to build a solution. The deeper they delved into the equation, the more it unraveled, branching into infinite complexities that nullified their calculations. Minutes stretched into hours, and the once calm academic atmosphere of the auditorium grew tense. The students, many of whom had entered the challenge with unwavering confidence, now displayed signs of strain. Some adjusted their neural interfaces as though recalibrating their cognitive enhancements would change their lack of progress. Others exchanged hushed whispers, attempting to reframe their approaches. A few simply sat in contemplation, their initial enthusiasm replaced by quiet resignation. Among them, Eric remained the only participant who showed no sign of struggle. His expression was composed, his movements unhurried. He was not racing against time or relying on computational shortcuts. He was thinking, breaking down the problem in ways that seemed almost too simple compared to the elaborate methods of the other scholars. Professor Varon finally spoke, his deep voice resonating through the auditorium. "Is there a flaw in the equation's structure?" The question was directed at no one in particular, yet it sent a ripple of uncertainty through the room. The suggestion that the equation itself might be flawed was nearly unthinkable. It had been passed down through centuries of academia, studied and tested by the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. To suggest an error in its foundation would be to challenge the very credibility of those who had built their theories upon it. The Dra scholar was the first to respond, his voice low and edged with irritation. "No, the equation is fundamentally sound. The failure lies in our inability to discern its correct form." The Vila student, whose shifting hues reflected doubt, spoke next. "If the equation is sound, then why does every known mathematical framework fail to resolve it?" A heavy silence followed. Eric, who had remained focused on his calculations, finally set his stylus down. He turned toward the group of scholars, his expression unreadable. "The equation isn't flawed," he said simply, "but the way you're all looking at it is." The room, which had been restless only moments before, became unnervingly still. All eyes turned to him. The Zith scholars twitched their antennae in synchronized curiosity. The Vila student's crystalline structure dimmed slightly, a sign of hesitation. The Dra scholar let out a slow exhale, his sharp eyes narrowing. Professor Varon studied Eric with renewed interest. "Explain." Eric met his gaze without hesitation. "You're all trying to solve this like it's a puzzle with missing pieces, but this isn't a puzzle. It's a sentence written in a language no one here has ever spoken fluently." The analogy was unexpected. The alien scholars exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from skepticism to intrigue. The Dra scholar scoffed. "You imply that the equation is not a mathematical structure but a form of communication." Eric shrugged. Mathematics is a language. You're treating this problem as if it's a theoretical construct that needs to be balanced within existing principles. But what if it's not meant to be solved with logic alone? What if it requires interpretation? Professor Varen's golden eyes flickered with something unreadable. He gestured toward the holographic board, the vast equation still shifting and reforming as if it possessed a mind of its own. Then tell us, Eric Morris, what is this equation saying? Eric looked back at the symbols, his gaze sharp with understanding. It's telling a story, he said, and I think I'm starting to understand how it ends. For the first time since the challenge began, uncertainty gripped the scholars. The human was claiming to have insight that eluded even the most advanced minds in the galaxy. And yet, as they watched him turn back to his calculations with the same quiet confidence, none of them could ignore the unsettling feeling that he might be right. Eric stood before the massive holographic projection, his fingers curling slightly around the stylus as he considered his next move. The silent expectation of the room pressed against him, but he did not let it shake his focus. He had seen this before, this kind of tension, this kind of disbelief. It was the same reaction people had when a method they trusted was suddenly exposed as flawed, when the security of their certainty was upended by something unfamiliar. He tapped the surface of his tablet, clearing his previous work. The equation hung in the air, shifting like a living thing, refusing to settle into a static form. His mind was already pulling apart its layers, not with brute computational force, but with an instinctual understanding that came from years of pattern recognition, of seeing the underlying structure in things where others saw only chaos. Without a word, he began writing. The first few strokes of his stylus were slow, deliberate. He did not work in the same way as the others had. There were no neural links feeding him real-time data, no quantum-assisted calculations running in the background. Instead, he took the most fundamental approach possible. He simplified. The alien scholars watched in stunned silence as he erased entire sections of the equation. The glowing symbols vanished under his hand, replaced by new, more streamlined notations. He was not merely solving the problem, he was reconstructing it, translating it into a form that no one had considered. Professor Varen leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes narrowing. He had lived long enough to see prodigies rise and fall, to witness breakthroughs and failures alike. And yet in all his centuries of teaching, he had never seen a student disregard the established framework so completely. The Draw scholar let out a sharp exhale, his clawed fingers tapping against his arm in restless irritation. What is he doing? The Vila student, whose crystalline body pulsed with an erratic rhythm, hesitated before answering. He's restructuring the problem from the ground up. The Zith scholars, who had been observing in synchronized silence, finally spoke in unison. He is not solving the equation. He is rewriting the language in which it is written. Eric ignored the growing murmur behind him. He was deep in thought, his focus absolute. He saw it now, how the equation had been constructed, how it had evolved over the centuries as different civilizations attempted to decipher it. Each generation of scholars had added something, another layer of complexity, another assumption. But assumptions were dangerous things. Assumptions led to blind spots. And now, standing before the culmination of millennia of misguided attempts, he was peeling it back to its purest form. He could feel the moment of realization coming. It was a sensation he knew well, that rush of clarity when all the scattered pieces clicked into place. His movements became faster, more fluid. The symbols he wrote burned brightly against the holographic interface, forming a sequence that none of the other scholars had ever considered. The silence in the room grew heavier. The Draw scholar's tail twitched, his frustration deepening. This is madness. The equation cannot be reduced to such simplicity. It is a multi-dimensional construct. It cannot be written in such a primitive form. Professor Varen did not look away from Eric's work, and yet he does not hesitate. The Vila student's glow dimmed in realization, because he sees something we do not. Eric stepped back, his hand hovering above his final line of notation. His breath was steady, his expression unreadable. He had done it. The room remained frozen, the weight of disbelief pressing against the gathered scholars like a physical force. No one spoke. No one moved. The equation, once a tangled mass of complexity, now stood before them in a form so simple it was almost absurd. Professor Varon rose from his seat, his gaze locked onto the holographic board. He studied the revised equation, his golden eyes flickering with something between awe and calculation. "This cannot be," the Draw scholar muttered, his voice low and strained. He surged forward, his clawed hands moving rapidly as he ran independent calculations, trying to disprove what had just been done. His breath came heavier as each test yielded the same result. The answer was undeniable. The Vila student placed a hand against the interface, her crystalline form trembling as her network processed the new equation. It was perfect. The patterns that had eluded her species for centuries were now as clear as sunlight breaking through the void of space. The Zith scholars, so devoted to their collective reasoning, now found themselves at a loss for words. Their synchronized thought patterns faltered, their structured unity breaking apart as they tried, and failed to understand how a single unaugmented human had accomplished what their entire species could not. Eric remained still, waiting. He knew the moment was coming, the shift, the moment when perception shattered, when doubt gave way to acceptance. He had felt it before, seen it in the eyes of those who once underestimated him. Professor Varon slowly turned to face him. "You did not solve the equation," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Eric met his gaze, unflinching. "No," he agreed. "I showed you that it was never a problem to begin with." A murmur spread through the room, disbelief intertwining with stunned admiration. The implications of his words settled over the scholars like a weight they were not yet ready to bear. The Draw scholar clenched his jaw, his pride warring with the undeniable truth before him. The Vila student exhaled softly, a sound like the gentle chime of glass ringing in deep space. The Zith scholars remained silent, their minds struggling to process what had just occurred. Professor Varon nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Then tell me, Eric Morris, if this was never a problem to solve, what was it?" Eric allowed himself a small smile. It was a question waiting for the right answer. And for the first time in recorded history, the greatest minds in the galaxy realized that the right answer had come from a human. The silence in the grand auditorium stretched long after Eric's final words. The weight of his statement settled over the gathered scholars like an unspoken challenge, a realization too vast to be fully comprehended in mere moments. The equation had not been an unsolvable problem, but a misinterpreted question, one that had lingered in the annals of intergalactic academia for thousands of years, waiting for someone to approach it with a fresh perspective. Professor Varon stood unmoving, his golden eyes scanning the holographic board, tracing the elegant simplicity of the human's revised notation. He was not a being prone to impulsive reactions, nor was he one to accept revolutionary ideas without scrutiny. And yet, as he studied the lines of numbers and symbols, as he cross-referenced Eric's logic against the core principles of mathematics that had guided civilizations for millennia, he found no flaw. The Draw scholar, still unwilling to accept defeat, continued running calculations, his clawed fingers tapping furiously against his interface. The Vila student, whose crystalline form pulsed with soft waves of refracted light, had gone utterly still, her mind engaged in the delicate process of reevaluating an entire branch of theoretical science in light of the human's discovery. Eric, standing before them all, felt the shift in the air. He had seen this before, that moment when resistance met undeniable truth, when the mind fought against change before finally yielding to understanding. He knew it was coming, but he also knew that change was never immediate. It was slow, reluctant, often painful. Professor Varon finally spoke, his voice calm yet carrying a weight that pressed into the very fabric of the room. "Explain your reasoning." Eric nodded. He had expected this. "The equation was never meant to be solved through conventional means," he said, turning back to the board. He gestured to the original problem, allowing the shifting symbols to realign themselves into their previous convoluted form. Every attempt to decode it added more complexity because it was being analyzed through the wrong framework. Each civilization that studied it assumed that the missing component was a variable to be discovered. But the missing component was never a variable, it was an axiom. The Vila student let out a soft, chiming sound, a crystalline exhalation of realization. A foundational principle. Eric nodded. Exactly. The reason no one could solve it was because everyone was trying to find an answer within existing parameters. But the equation itself was questioning those parameters. It wasn't asking for a solution. It was asking for a paradigm shift.